Hello, friends, and welcome to this podcast. I'm going to talk about somebody everybody talks about. People who are into music, into this kind of music, sort of prog music, people who watch YouTube. Robert Fripp, guitar player Robert Fripp, who sits on a stool and very carefully concentrates on every arpeggiated note he's playing in these intricate looping patterns that he does in a lot of his work. He's always been one of these guitar players you can immediately recognize when you hear his sound. It's like, oh, that's Robert Fripp, or it's somebody totally ripping him off because he's got a very distinct sound, and he's known for King Crimson, of course, but he's worked with a lot of really cool other musical types, other musicians. Obviously, you know, the ones that we all know about, David Bowie and then David Sylvian, a little bit less well known. But people like that, you know, he's worked with Brian Eno. There's Fripp and Eno did some things together. They did an album of ambient, sort of trippy, loopy, ambient type stuff called No Pussyfooting in 1973. And then he did some, King Crimson, which was a pretty major thing. King Crimson started before his collaborations with Brian Eno, but first King Crimson album, 1969. Right before that, like months, evidently, not even a year before The Court of the Crimson King came out, he made an album with, some notable folks called The Cheerful Insanity of Giles, and Fripp, which sounds like a kind of one of those sort of Zappa-esque comedy albums, like you're going to hear a bunch of people doing random acid trip kind of poetry or whatever, like get on the bus and we're going to go tripping. But it's really not that. It's more, it's actually it's like a proto-prog kind of album. It's one of those albums that I think, I've talked before about how I think psychedelic music segued into progressive rock, like prog music. I think bands like, the obvious ones like Yes, when they first started, were sort of on the outer edges of psychedelic, obviously Pink Floyd too, the first Pink Floyd albums, psychedelic, and then it blended into prog. So I think a lot of bands were sort of into the psychedelic thing, which was freedom in the recording studio, adventurous approach to instrumentation and song structure, and trippy lyrics, that kind of, the lyrics that aren't straightforward. They don't, they're not talking to, they're not singing songs about, my girlfriend left me and whatnot. They're sort of singing about existential type things, and mythology, and strange visions, visuals, that kind of stuff. The psychedelic realms, which is one of the things that carried over into prog, because prog lyrics a lot of times still, they sort of held on to that the trippy imagery in the lyrics. I mean, listen to any Yes album, and King Crimson is the same. King Crimson, I think, there's a lot of arguments, which was the first, whatever, who was the first. Some people say The Court of the Crimson King is the first proper prog album. It could be 1969, Court of the Crimson King. It's definitely prog because people kind of riffed on it. It was one of those records that there was a before and an after, and so when that album came out, bands changed. Prog bands sort of, I think, left behind all of their, or most of their psychedelic trappings, and said, let's go there instead. Let's go to prog land. So Fripp has been around through a lot of this stuff. He's been there in these heavy bands, I think too, like, you know, when you think about King Crimson, a lot of that early stuff is super heavy, you know, like this almost proto metal too. There's like this grinding assault to the guitars sometimes, and the compositions have a real you know, but then there's also some beautiful moments, you know, some flute rock in there too. King Crimson is fantastic. I could go off on a whole 24-hour rant about King Crimson, which I might do, but for now, I just want to talk about Robert Fripp and his thing. You know, he did these solo albums. He did the work with David Bowie that we all know about. He was on this album, which I think is a great example of what Robert Fripp could bring to an album by David Bowie. You know, like David Bowie is kind of a pop singer. You know, his songs, he's definitely experimented and pushed envelopes, but he wrote songs in a very traditional, you know, verse chorus, and he brought Robert Fripp in on this album, Scary Monsters, as well as Heroes. Of course, you know, there's that sort of some people think it's a bit annoying even that what Robert Fripp is playing on Heroes and on here too. It can kind of be jarring, and but it adds so much texture and a hook, you know, like a irresistible dynamic hook to the songs of David Bowie. One thing you might not know is that he worked with another singer named Daryl Hall, who you may know as part of Hall & Oates. But Daryl Hall, there's no denying that Daryl Hall is a fantastic musician and songwriter. I mean, as much as you may not appreciate the FM radio onslaught that we got from them when they were popular, and it seemed like they were everywhere on MTV and in the radio, Hall & Oates with their kind of FM radio pop. He also had kind of another side to him, and there's these videos that you can check out on YouTube where people go to his house and play music with him in his incredible recording studio. Daryl's house, I think. I don't know what it's called, but look it up. It's pretty interesting. It makes you realize, wow, there's more to Daryl Hall than Maneater, you know. But this album is kind of hard to find, I think. Might be, maybe not. Sacred Songs. Robert Fripp did a solo album called Exposure, which is fantastic. I don't have it on vinyl, or I do have it on vinyl, but I don't know where it is. It's in the boxes somewhere. But Exposure is another sort of jarring album that 1979, and it had samples on it. And I think a lot of people around that time were doing this kind of thing with samples, you know, not just the hip hop style of sampling music, but sampling dialogue, sampling voices. Exposure had some samples of, or actually, I don't know if you want to call them samples. It's just a found recording of an argument that Fripp recorded in an apartment. There's other field recordings like that, and he wrote these King Crimson-y kind of guitar parts around him. Around that same time, he did this Daryl Hall album, which I have 2 copies of for some reason. Why is that? But it's a good album, and it's produced by Robert Fripp, and Fripp plays on it. And I think they work together the way he works together with people. Like when he worked together with David Sylvian, I think it was like a collaboration. Whereas his guitar performance on Scary Monsters was evidently, according to legend, Bowie said, "Come in," and I think, I think the production was, I mean, they were already kind of done. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but they said, put the phones on, put your guitar, plug your guitar in and listen to it and just play it without knowing the song. And he kind of came up with something spontaneously. I believe that's what happened. That's the rumor, and you can check me, tell me if I'm wrong. But I think that's what happened. And so Fripp's approach to things sometimes can be experimental, and I think working with Daryl Hall was kind of an interesting concept, and it works. It's actually not a bad album. Daryl Hall's got a great voice. He's a great songwriter, and Fripp also worked with other sort of prog people. He did some work with Vandergraaf Generator, and he also worked with some really poppy people, like famous pop rockers, like Andy Summers of the Police. He and Robert Fripp did some great stuff together. He did a solo thing called A League of Gentlemen and A League of Crafty Whatevers, and these are interesting albums, but I don't really go back to a lot of the stuff like this as much as I do certain other Fripp things. But you know what I think is like the Frippiest of Fripp? It's a King Crimson album that was sort of like a reimagining, sort of a reboot of King Crimson that happened in 1981, which is a totally new wave kind of year. You were either new wave or you were like insipid radio pop rock that everybody was just disco, that kind of stuff. Disco was kind of fading in 1981, but it still had that kind of I don't know, I guess cheesiness to it. So 1981 was either like really good stuff that you didn't really hear too much on the radio where I lived, and like radio pop, But anyway, 1981, something happened. King Crimson sort of came back, and suddenly everyone was talking about this album, and it is called Discipline. It's a really listenable album, but it's also heavy, experimental in a lot of ways. It's not. You put this on and it does not sound like anything else. Even now it doesn't. I mean, it sounds like some Robert Fripp stuff, but if you sound like this, you're copying Robert Fripp, if that makes any sense. You can't rip off Robert Fripp without obviously ripping off Robert Fripp, He's so distinct and so unique, and he's so Frippy that you can't rip him off. And plus it's really hard to rip him off because the stuff he plays sounds like these sort of arpeggiated, almost like wonky scales that he'll play in these repeating patterns that sort of overlap each other, that are like offset in a way that they go out of sync and then they come back into sync. Things like that, really complicated, very proggy, but in a 1981 way. And he had, it was him and Adrian Belew who were playing the guitar parts together. And Adrian Belew is another sort of astounding guitar player. And it also has, on this album, you got Tony Levin playing bass, and he's not just playing a bass guitar, he's playing this thing called a Chapman Stick, which is I played one. I'm a bass player. I played bass in bands, and so I know a bit about a 4-string bass, can fake it on a 5-string. But this thing has got like 50 million strings, and you don't really pluck the strings. You don't pluck them with a pick or with your fingers. You sort of, it's all about tapping on the fretboard. And I tried it, and I could get some sounds out of it, but it's like rethinking the whole idea. So I kind of, first of all, couldn't afford one, but it felt like, I feel comfortable with the 4-string bass. But Tony Levin is a fantastic bass player out there still, with people like Peter Gabriel and whatnot. Obviously pretty decent bass player. But also on this album is Bill Bruford, who is one of my favorites You know him from King Crimson. You know him from Yes. You know him from his solo albums and his various projects and his work with other people. But he is a very meticulous, very proggy drummer. He plays these patterns and these sequences and very, very precise. If you were in a band with him, you would totally trust him to be the metronome. You wouldn't have to worry about him speeding up or slowing down or anything like that, because he's a machine, which is perfect for these sort of mad genius types like Robert Fripp and Adrian Belew and Tony Levin to play with, because the whole band was this machine that was this, like, one sequence is going this fast, another one is going this fast, another one is going this fast, and another one is going like this. It's like, and I'll put all four of those bits together and you have that album Discipline, which is and it's beautiful too. It turns out that these kind of these arpeggiated notes, there's also chording on there, but these notes, these dun, 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 these patterns of single notes played by multiple instruments in these varied sequences and time signatures. Even I think within the same song, this guitar player is playing in one time signature, and then the other one is playing in a different time signature, and the way those overlap against each other it takes a lot of discipline to play that kind of stuff. And I think that's where the title of the album came from, because it's really hard to play it. And they were probably like, this takes a lot of discipline. And somebody said, that's what we should call the album. So anyway, I really like Discipline. I still go back and listen to that. There's, of course, a few other of the Adrian Belew, Tony Levin and Robert Fripp, King Crimson albums after that one. But that one came along right around the time when the sort of post-punk thing and a lot of pop bands were happening, and there were the Police and the Jam and whatever else I was listening to, and then King Crimson, and suddenly it was okay. It was okay to be into prog, and I think even I remember even very proud punk rockers were wearing the red Discipline concert shirt. And a lot of people went and saw them. I saw them live on the Discipline tour. I saw them play in Atlanta. And then after the show, they came out and just chatted, like cool people. And a lot of what they were doing, it was so interesting that everybody who was into music back then, and now, but back then, it was when it was fresh and new, a lot of people who were playing music were listening to that and trying to sort of, how can I incorporate that cool these patterns and these looping arpeggios into pop music and into what I'm doing, and so I think a lot of people were sort of pushed into amping up their game, so to speak, as guitar players, after hearing someone like Adrian Belew doing these wild squawking whammy bar noises, and then segueing perfectly into these intricate strangeness along with Robert Fripp. It's fascinating to listen to that album. I mean, put on the headphones and really just get into these patterns as sort of a Philip Glass hypnotic, like gamelan music or something. I think that might be some part of the inspiration, is those repeating the repeating motifs of some Asian music like that. But anyway, that's me talking about Robert Fripp. Really like Robert Fripp. He's still relevant. That guy. He's never gonna become uncool, I think. And even now, he's sort of an older guy, but he's doing these YouTube videos with his incredible wife, Toya Wilcox. The two of them sit in the kitchen, I guess, and it's like Toya and Robert's Sunday lunch videos on YouTube, and they're hilarious. They're really fun, and you realize Robert Fripp is actually really funny. He's got this, and you've always heard that in interviews when he's so serious on stage. He sits down. He doesn't go to the edge of the stage and rock out and, you know, you want to party. You know, he's not that guy. He sits on the stool and he doesn't groove around or anything. He just plays his parts and concentrates on the music, and he, you know, tweaks knobs on various outboard gear and whatnot. But in the Toya and Robert Sunday lunch videos, he is exploring his cheerful insanity, the cheerful insanity of Fripp and Wilcox, Robert and Toya, and it kind of takes you back to that first those first moments of his musical career with the cheerful insanity of Giles, and Fripp, where he was doing these kind of humorous kind of things, but it was serious music. It wasn't that kind of, you know, lose your mind kind of music and people like screaming and laughing and reciting purposefully bad poetry or anything like that. This is genuinely well composed, well played, well thought out, very intelligent music, but it's got that kind of Monty Python-ish vibe to it. And I recommend all of it. I recommend everything Fripp did. I like his solo album Exposure is really that's an interesting one that I think doesn't get enough attention. You don't hear a lot of people talking about it, but people who really like Robert Fripp have it, of course. But that's got some really fun, really fantastic stuff on it. And again, that Daryl Hall thing is worth looking for. I mean, you might be able to find some snips from it on YouTube or something. But anyway, that's me talking about Robert Fripp. I think he is a fascinating guitar player, somebody that I've sort of studied, but also one of those people that I can only get to a certain point before I'm like, all right, he's better than me, and just, you know, give it up. But that's where I'm going to stop for right now about Robert Fripp. I could go on and on, I guess, but that's it for now. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you again real soon.